The woman appeared like a ghost through the sheets of rain, stumbling along the muddy road with her dress plastered to her skin and her dark hair hanging in soaked ropes down her back. Harrison Garrett pulled his horse to a halt, squinting through the downpour to make sure his eyes were not playing tricks on him in the fading light of late afternoon. No, she was real enough, and she was clearly in trouble, her movements growing more unsteady with each step she took along the treacherous path between Nogales, Arizona, and the scattered ranches beyond. "Madam," Harrison called out, urging his gelding forward through the mud. "Madam, are you all right?" The woman turned toward his voice, her face pale beneath the grime and rain. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but her legs gave out beneath her, and Harrison jumped from his saddle just in time to catch her before she hit the ground. Up close, he could see she was young, probably not much past 20, and shivering violently from the cold rain that had thoroughly drenched her thin traveling dress. "I have got you," Harrison said, steadying her against his chest. "Can you tell me what happened?" "The stage," she managed through chattering teeth. "Wheel broke. Driver told us to walk to the next town. The others went ahead, but I could not keep up." Harrison felt anger flash through him at the thought of a stage driver abandoning passengers in this weather, but he pushed it aside to deal with the more immediate problem. The woman was soaked to the bone and clearly exhausted. They were still a good 5 miles from Nogales, and his ranch was closer, maybe 3 miles if they cut across the valley. "Can you ride?" he asked. She nodded weakly, and Harrison helped her up onto his horse before swinging up behind her. He wrapped his coat around her shaking shoulders and pulled her back against his chest, trying to share what warmth he could as he turned the gelding toward home. The rain continued to fall in heavy curtains, turning the world into a gray blur of water and mud. Harrison had been riding the boundary of his property, checking fences before the storm hit, when he had spotted her. Now, as they rode through the downpour, he found himself acutely aware of the woman trembling in his arms. She felt small and fragile against him, and he tightened his hold slightly, both to keep her steady in the saddle and to offer whatever comfort he could. "What is your name?" Harrison asked, speaking close to her ear so she could hear him over the rain. "Flora," she said, her voice barely audible. "Flora Owens. I am Harrison Garrett. My ranch is not far. We will get you warm and dry." Flora did not respond, and Harrison felt her weight grow heavier against him as exhaustion claimed her. He kept one arm firmly around her waist as he guided the horse through the familiar landscape, now transformed by the storm into something alien and threatening. Lightning cracked across the sky, followed by a roll of thunder that made the gelding sidestep nervously. "Easy," Harrison murmured, steadying both the horse and the woman in his arms. By the time they reached the ranch house, the rain had eased slightly to a steady drumming rather than the violent deluge it had been. Harrison dismounted carefully, then reached up to lift Flora down. She was barely conscious, her eyes half closed and her lips tinged with blue from the cold. The ranch house was modest but well built, a sturdy structure of wood and stone that Harrison had helped his father build before the old man passed 2 years ago. Harrison carried Flora inside, kicking the door shut behind them against the wind and rain. The house was dark and cold, the fire in the hearth long since died to ashes. Harrison laid Flora on the sofa near the fireplace and quickly set about building a new fire, his hands moving with practiced efficiency despite his own wet clothes and the urgency driving him. Within minutes, flames were crackling and beginning to throw heat into the room. Only then did he turn his attention back to his unexpected guest. Flora was still shivering violently, her wet dress spreading dampness across his sofa. Harrison knew he needed to get her out of those wet clothes, but propriety warred with practicality. Finally, necessity won. He went to his bedroom and pulled out one of his flannel shirts and a pair of wool socks, then returned to find Flora's eyes open and watching him with a dazed expression. "Miss Owens," Harrison said gently, "you need to get out of those wet clothes. I will turn my back, and you can change into this. It is not much, but it is dry and warm." Flora nodded slowly and took the clothing from him with trembling hands. Harrison turned to face the wall, listening to the rustle of wet fabric and trying not to think too hard about the woman undressing in his living room. After what seemed like an eternity, Flora's soft voice said, "I am done." Harrison turned back to find her wrapped in his shirt, which hung nearly to her knees, her pale legs covered by his thick wool socks. Her wet dress lay in a sodden heap on the floor. She looked impossibly young and vulnerable, her dark hair still dripping water down her back. "Sit by the fire," Harrison instructed, grabbing a towel from the kitchen. He handed it to her and then gathered up her wet dress. "I will hang this to dry. There is a blanket on the back of the sofa." While Flora dried her hair and wrapped herself in the blanket, Harrison changed into dry clothes in his bedroom, then returned to stoke the fire higher. The warmth was beginning to fill the room, driving back the chill of the storm. He put a kettle on to boil for tea, then sat in the chair across from Flora, finally allowing himself to really look at her. She was beautiful, he realized, even with her hair in tangles and her face drawn with exhaustion. Her eyes were a striking green, and there was something about the delicate line of her jaw and the way she held herself, even wrapped in his oversized shirt and a blanket, that spoke of strength beneath the fragility. "Thank you," Flora said softly, meeting his gaze. "You saved my life." "I just happened to be riding that way," Harrison said, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Any decent person would have done the same." "Perhaps," Flora said, "but you were the one who was there." The kettle whistled and Harrison made tea, pouring it into 2 chipped mugs. He handed one to Flora and she wrapped her hands around it gratefully, breathing in the steam. "What were you doing on that stage?" Harrison asked, settling back into his chair with his own mug. Flora was quiet for a long moment, staring into her tea. "Running away," she finally said. "Or maybe running towards something. I am not sure which." Harrison waited, sensing there was more to the story. "I was engaged to be married," Flora continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "back in St. Louis, to a man my father chose. A banker, wealthy and respectable and absolutely wrong for me in every way that mattered. So you left, 3 days before the wedding. I took what money I had saved and bought a ticket west. I thought maybe I could find work as a teacher or a seamstress, something to start over." She looked up at Harrison, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. "My father will never forgive me." "But you will forgive yourself," Harrison said, surprised by his own certainty. "That seems more important." Flora smiled for the first time, a small, tentative expression that transformed her face. "You are kind." "I am practical," Harrison corrected, but he felt something warm unfurl in his chest at her smile. They sat in comfortable silence, drinking their tea and listening to the rain drum against the roof. Harrison found himself studying Flora when she was not looking, noting the way the firelight caught in her drying hair, turning it to shades of chestnut and gold. She was not like the women in Nogales, the few unmarried ones who made it clear they would welcome his attention. There was something different about Flora, something that spoke of education and refinement, but also a core of determination that had carried her away from everything she knew. "You should sleep," Harrison said eventually. "You can take my bed, I will stay out here." "I could not take your bed," Flora protested. "You can and you will. I have slept in worse places than a sofa." Harrison stood, brooking no argument. "Come on, I will show you." Flora followed him to the bedroom, still wrapped in the blanket. The room was simple, containing a bed with a worn quilt, a dresser, and a small table with a lamp. Harrison lit the lamp and turned down the bed. "There is a basin and pitcher if you want to wash," he said, gesturing to the dresser. "I will be right outside if you need anything." "Harrison," Flora said, and it was the first time she had used his given name. "Thank you for everything." "Get some rest, Miss Owens," Harrison said, backing toward the door before he could do something foolish like tell her she was beautiful, or that finding her in the rain felt like fate, or any of the other ridiculous thoughts running through his head. He closed the door behind him and returned to the living room, where he settled onto the sofa with a spare blanket. The rain continued outside, but the house was warm and dry, and somewhere in his bedroom was a woman who had appeared out of nowhere and turned his quiet evening into something else entirely. Harrison had lived alone for 2 years, since his father died and his mother followed 6 months later, her heart broken by the loss of her husband of 30 years. The solitude had suited him, or so he had thought. He worked his cattle, maintained his property, and kept to himself except for occasional trips into Nogales for supplies. He was 26 years old, and people had started to talk about him becoming a confirmed bachelor, but Harrison had not cared. He had not met anyone who made him want to change his solitary life. Until now, perhaps. Harrison stared at the ceiling, listening to the soft sounds of Flora moving around in his bedroom, and wondered what tomorrow would bring. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the world washed clean and sparkling in the early sunlight. Harrison woke to find himself stiff from sleeping on the sofa, his neck protesting as he sat up. He built up the fire and put coffee on to brew, moving quietly so as not to wake Flora. He was outside tending to his horse when she emerged from the house, still wearing his shirt and the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her hair was loose around her face, and she looked rested, the color back in her cheeks. "Good morning," Flora said, shading her eyes against the sun. "Morning," Harrison replied, finishing with the gelding and walking over to her. "How do you feel?" "Much better. A little embarrassed about last night." "Nothing to be embarrassed about. You were exhausted and half frozen." Harrison gestured back toward the house. "Coffee is ready, and I can make some breakfast if you are hungry." They ate together at the small kitchen table, scrambled eggs and biscuits left over from the day before. Flora ate hungrily, and Harrison found himself pleased to see her appetite returning. "What will you do now?" Harrison asked when they had finished eating. Flora set down her fork, her expression growing troubled. "I suppose I should continue on to Nogales, try to find work as I planned." "Nogales is not a big town," Harrison said carefully. "Work might be hard to come by, especially for a woman on her own." "I know," Flora met his eyes, "but I have to try. I cannot go back." Harrison made a decision that surprised himself. "You could stay here for a while at least, until you figure out what you want to do." Flora stared at him. "I could not impose on you like that. It would not be an imposition. The house is big enough and I could use help around the place. My mother used to keep a garden and the chickens and do the cooking. I have been managing, but barely." Harrison found himself speaking faster, trying to convince her before he lost his nerve. "It would be a fair trade. Room and board for your help. Nothing more." "Nothing more," Flora repeated slowly, and Harrison wondered if he imagined the hint of disappointment in her voice. "Unless you wanted it to be more," Harrison heard himself say, then felt his face heat. "I mean in the future. Maybe. If things worked out, but no pressure, you would be safe here, I promise you that." Flora was quiet for so long that Harrison thought she was going to refuse. Then she smiled, that same transformative expression from the night before, and said, "I would like that. Very much." Relief flooded through Harrison, followed quickly by a surge of something else, something warm and bright that he had not felt in a long time. "Good," he said, unable to keep the smile off his own face. "That is good." Flora settled into life on the ranch with surprising ease. Her traveling dress dried and was mended, but she continued to wear Harrison's old shirts and a pair of his pants that she had altered to fit her, claiming they were more practical for the work that needed doing. Harrison tried not to notice how the sight of her in his clothes did strange things to his heartbeat. She threw herself into reviving his mother's garden, spending hours in the sun coaxing life from the soil. She tended the chickens and gathered eggs, and she proved to be a far better cook than Harrison, turning simple ingredients into meals that reminded him of his childhood. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the valley, talking about everything and nothing. Harrison learned that Flora had been educated at a finishing school, that she spoke French and could play the piano, though there was no piano within miles for her to practice on. She had read more books than Harrison had known existed, and she would tell him stories from them, her voice animated and her eyes bright. In turn, Harrison told her about growing up on the ranch, about his father teaching him to rope cattle and break horses, about his mother's quiet strength and the way she had held the family together. He told her about the loneliness of the past 2 years, though he had not really recognized it as loneliness until Flora arrived and filled the empty spaces he had not known existed. Weeks passed, and Harrison found himself falling into a pattern that felt dangerously close to domestic bliss. He would wake early and do his work around the ranch, always aware of where Flora was, what she was doing. He would find excuses to be near her, to work in the garden while she weeded, to help her carry water for the chickens. One afternoon, nearly a month after she arrived, Harrison came back from checking the cattle to find Flora sitting on the porch steps, crying. He was off his horse in an instant, dropping down beside her. "What is wrong? Are you hurt?" Flora shook her head, wiping at her tears with the back of her hand. "I got a letter. From my sister. She managed to send it to the general store in Nogales, and I picked it up today when I went for supplies." Harrison waited, his hand hovering near her shoulder, wanting to touch her but uncertain if he should. "My father is furious," Flora continued, her voice breaking. "He has disowned me, says I am no daughter of his. But my sister, she says she understands. She is proud of me for being brave." Fresh tears spilled down Flora's cheeks. "I thought I was ready to lose them. I thought I had accepted it, but it hurts so much." "I am sorry," Harrison said, and this time he did put his hand on her shoulder, a gentle weight of comfort. Flora turned into him, and Harrison found himself holding her while she cried, her face pressed against his chest and her tears soaking into his shirt. He stroked her hair awkwardly at first, then with more confidence as she leaned into his touch. "You are not alone," Harrison said quietly. "You have me, for as long as you want." Flora pulled back to look up at him, her eyes red-rimmed but searching his face. "Do I? Have you, I mean?" Harrison's heart was pounding so hard he was certain she could hear it. "Yes," he said simply. "If you want me." "I do," Flora whispered. "I have wanted you for weeks now, but I did not know if you felt the same." "I feel the same," Harrison said, and then, because words seemed inadequate, he kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, his lips barely brushing hers. But then Flora's arms came up around his neck, and she kissed him back with a passion that took his breath away. Harrison pulled her closer, one hand tangling in her hair while the other splayed across the small of her back. And for a moment, the world consisted only of Flora's mouth on his and the way she fit perfectly in his arms. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Harrison rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said, the words coming easier than he had expected. "I think I have loved you since I found you in that rainstorm." "I love you too," Flora said, her smile brilliant even through her tears. "You are the sunshine I never knew I needed." Harrison laughed, giddy with relief and joy. "I thought you were my sunshine." "Then we are sunshine for each other," Flora said and kissed him again. They were married 3 weeks later, in a small ceremony in Nogales with the local minister and a few of Harrison's friends from neighboring ranches as witnesses. Flora wore a simple blue dress that she had sewn herself, and Harrison wore his Sunday best. The ceremony was brief, but when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Harrison felt something settle into place inside him, a rightness he had never experienced before. Their wedding night was spent in the ranch house that was now truly their home together. Harrison was gentle with Flora, patient and tender as they learned each other in the flickering lamplight. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the bed, Flora's head on Harrison's chest and his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "Are you happy?" Harrison asked softly. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Flora said, tilting her head up to kiss his jaw. "When I ran away from St. Louis, I had no idea what I was running toward, but it was you. It was always you. Lucky for me you got stranded in that rainstorm," Harrison said. "Lucky for me, you were the one who found me." Life settled into a new rhythm after the wedding. Flora proved to be a natural ranch wife, adapting to the hard work and isolation with the same determination she had shown in everything else. She expanded the garden, adding herbs and flowers alongside the vegetables. She learned to ride, and Harrison would often come home to find her out checking the cattle or riding the boundary fences, her hair streaming behind her and her face alight with joy. In the evenings, they would lie in bed and make plans for the future. They would expand the herd, maybe hire some help. They would add a room onto the house for the children they hoped to have. Harrison would tell Flora about the land, teaching her to read the weather and the seasons, and Flora would read to him from the books she had brought from St. Louis, the ones she had managed to pack in her small bag before she fled. 6 months into their marriage, Flora began to feel ill in the mornings. Harrison worried until the doctor from Nogales confirmed what Flora already suspected. She was pregnant. Harrison was beside himself with joy and terror in equal measure. He became protective to the point of absurdity, insisting that Flora rest more, do less, let him handle everything. Flora tolerated it for about a week before she sat him down and told him firmly that she was pregnant, not made of glass, and if he did not let her continue helping around the ranch, she would lose her mind. "But what if something happens?" Harrison asked, his fear naked in his voice. "What if I lose you?" Flora took his face in her hands, making him look at her. "You are not going to lose me. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I am strong and healthy and everything is going to be fine. Promise me," Harrison said. "I promise," Flora said, and kissed him until his fears quieted. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, Flora's belly growing round as the months passed. Harrison found himself talking to the baby, his hand on Flora's stomach, as he told stories about the ranch and his parents, and how much this child was already loved. Flora's sister wrote again, sending her love and congratulations, and the news that she had stood up to their father, telling him he was wrong to turn his back on Flora. It had not changed his mind, but it eased something in Flora's heart to know that her sister was on her side. In late spring, as the wildflowers bloomed across the valley and the cattle grew fat on the new grass, Flora went into labor. Harrison rode hard to Nogales to fetch the doctor and the midwife. then spent the next 12 hours pacing outside the bedroom door while Flora labored within. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink when he heard a baby's cry. Harrison froze, his heart in his throat, until the midwife opened the door with a smile. "You have a son," she said. "A big, healthy boy, and your wife is asking for you." Harrison pushed past her into the bedroom, his eyes going immediately to Flora. She was propped up against the pillows, her hair damp with sweat, and her face exhausted but radiant. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in one of the blankets Harrison's mother had made years ago. "Come meet your son," Flora said softly. Harrison approached on shaky legs, looking down at the tiny face peeking out from the blanket. The baby had Flora's delicate features and a shock of dark hair, and his eyes when they opened were a blue that would probably darken to match Harrison's own. "He is perfect," Harrison whispered, reaching out to touch one impossibly small hand. The baby's fingers curled around his, gripping with surprising strength, and Harrison felt his throat close with emotion. "We made him," Flora said, wonder in her voice, "out of love and rainstorms and sunshine." Harrison sat carefully on the edge of the bed, putting his arm around Flora and looking down at their son. "What should we name him?" "I was thinking Henry," Flora said. "After your father." "Henry Garrett," Harrison said, testing the name. "I like it. My father would have liked it too." They named their son Henry Thomas Garrett, the middle name for Flora's grandfather, the one person in her family besides her sister who Flora said had ever truly understood her. Henry was a good baby, healthy and strong, and watching Flora nurse him or sing him to sleep brought Harrison a joy so profound it was almost painful. The first year of Henry's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and small miracles. His first smile, his first laugh, the day he rolled over and the day he sat up on his own. Harrison taught him to clap his hands, and Flora would dance around the kitchen with him in her arms, both of them laughing. The ranch prospered. Harrison hired a young man from town to help with the cattle, which freed up more of his time to spend with his family. He would come in from work to find Flora in the garden with Henry crawling in the dirt nearby, or the two of them on the porch, Flora reading aloud while Henry babbled along as if he understood. On their second anniversary, Harrison gave Flora a piano. He had ordered it from back east and had it shipped to Nogales at considerable expense, then enlisted the help of 3 men to get it into the house. Flora cried when she saw it, running her hands over the keys with reverence. "You did not have to do this," she said. "I wanted to," Harrison replied. "You gave up so much when you came here. The least I can do is give you back a little piece of it." Flora played that evening, filling the house with music for the first time. Henry sat on the floor at her feet, his eyes wide with wonder, and Harrison leaned against the wall and felt a contentment so complete it seemed impossible that life could get any better. But it did. 2 years after Henry was born, Flora gave birth to a daughter they named Helen Frances, the middle name for Flora's sister who had stood by her when no one else would. Helen had Flora's green eyes and Harrison's stubborn chin, and from the moment she was born, she had both her parents wrapped around her tiny finger. Henry adored his baby sister, toddling over to her cradle to show her his toys and singing her the songs Flora had sung to him. Harrison would watch his children together and feel his heart swell with a love he had not known he was capable of. Flora's sister Frances finally visited when Helen was 6 months old, making the long journey from St. Louis with her husband, a lawyer who had courted her properly and married her for love. The 2 sisters embraced on the porch, both of them crying, while Harrison and Frances's husband stood by awkwardly until Frances pulled Harrison into the hug as well. "Thank you," Frances whispered to Harrison, "for making my sister so happy." She makes me happy, Harrison said simply. Frances stayed for 2 weeks, getting to know her niece and nephew and marveling at the life Flora had built. On her last evening, the sisters sat on the porch while their husbands played with the children inside. "You ever regret it?" Frances asked. "Leaving St. Louis, giving up everything?" Flora looked out over the valley at the land she had come to love, at the house that had become her home. Through the window, she could see Harrison holding Helen while Henry climbed on his back, all three of them laughing. "Not even for a moment," Flora said. "This is exactly where I am supposed to be." The years passed, each one bringing new joys and challenges. Henry grew into a serious boy who loved the ranch and spent every spare moment following his father around, learning everything Harrison could teach him. Helen was wild and free, more likely to be found climbing trees or racing her pony across the valley than helping with household chores. When Henry was 8 and Helen 6, Flora gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named Harold and Hope. The house felt full to bursting with children and noise and love, and Harrison expanded it, adding on the extra rooms they had once dreamed about. Flora had been right. The twin births were hard, but she came through strong and healthy, nursing both babies while Henry and Helen crowded around to coo at their new siblings. Harrison watched his family and thought back to the lonely man he had been before that rainstorm, before Flora, and could barely recognize himself. One evening, when the twins were nursing and the older children were finally asleep, Harrison and Flora sat together on the porch, as they had done countless times before. The valley was quiet except for the sounds of the night, crickets chirping and a distant coyote howling. "Do you remember the night we met?" Harrison asked, taking Flora's hand in his. "How could I forget? I was certain I was going to die out there in that storm." "And I was certain I was going to live out my days alone," Harrison said. "Funny how wrong we both were." Flora leaned her head on his shoulder. "You saved me that night, in more ways than one." "You saved me too," Harrison said. "I was alive, but I was not really living, not until you came along and showed me what life could be." "We saved each other then," Flora said. "That seems fair." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. Inside the house, one of the twins began to fuss, and Flora sighed. "Duty calls," she said, starting to stand. Harrison pulled her back down for a kiss, deep and tender. "I love you, Flora Garrett. Today and every day for the rest of my life." "I love you too, Harrison Garrett," Flora said against his lips. "My cowboy who found me in the rain." The years continued to pass in a steady procession of seasons and celebrations. The children grew, each developing their own personality and dreams. Henry became as skilled a rancher as his father, taking over more and more of the daily operations as Harrison's hair began to gray. Helen shocked everyone by announcing at 16 that she wanted to be a doctor, and after much discussion, Harrison and Flora sent her back east to medical school, though it broke their hearts to have her so far away. Harold showed an unexpected talent for music, spending hours at his mother's piano, and Hope turned out to have Flora's love of books, reading everything she could get her hands on and filling notebooks with her own stories. Frances visited regularly, bringing her own growing family, and the children would run wild together across the ranch while the adults sat on the porch and reminisced. Frances told them that their father had softened in his old age, that he sometimes asked about Flora, though he had never taken back his words or reached out himself. "I do not need his apology," Flora said. "I have everything I need right here." When Harrison turned 50, Flora threw him a party, inviting everyone from Nogales and the surrounding ranches. The house and yard were packed with people, and Harrison stood in the middle of it all, watching his children and grandchildren play, his friends laugh and talk, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Flora found him standing alone near the barn, escaping the crowd for a moment of quiet. "There you are," she said, slipping her arm through his. "You cannot hide from your own party." "Not hiding, just taking it all in," Harrison said. 24 years ago I was alone in this place. Now look at it." 24 years ago I was drowning in a rainstorm," Flora said. "Literally and figuratively, and you pulled me out of it." "Best thing I ever did," Harrison said, pulling her close. "Best thing I ever did was get stranded in that storm," Flora countered. They returned to the party together, hand in hand, and danced under the stars to Harold's piano playing while their children and grandchildren and friends looked on. Helen came home from medical school with a degree, and a quiet young man named Joseph, who looked at her like she hung the moon. They were married on the ranch, and Helen set up a practice in Nogales, becoming the first female doctor in the territory and making her parents impossibly proud. Henry married a rancher's daughter from the next valley over, a practical woman named Sarah who fit seamlessly into the family. They gave Harrison and Flora their first great-grandchild, a boy with Henry's serious eyes and Sarah's gentle smile. Harold went to study music in San Francisco, and Hope became a teacher, opening a school in Nogales for children who might otherwise have no education. Through it all, Harrison and Flora remained the center of it all, the foundation upon which their family was built. They grew old together, their hair turning white and their movements slowing, but their love never diminishing. On their 40th anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered to celebrate. The house that Harrison had built with his father and expanded with his own hands was full to bursting with family. 3 generations of Garretts who existed because a lonely cowboy had found a desperate woman in a rainstorm, and both had been brave enough to take a chance on love. Harrison and Flora sat in their rocking chairs on the porch, watching the sun set over the valley as they had done thousands of times before. Flora's hand was in Harrison's, their fingers intertwined, and both were content. "You think we did all right?" Harrison asked. "With everything, I mean." "The ranch, the children, all of it." "I think we did better than all right," Flora said. "Look at them, Harrison. Look at what we built together." Inside the house, they could hear laughter and music, the sound of their family celebrating. Harrison thought about the choices that had led them here. Flora's courage in running away from a life that would have stifled her. His decision to ride out and check those fences on a day that looked like rain. The moment he had decided to bring her home instead of taking her straight to Nogales. The even more important moment when he had asked her to stay. "I would do it all again," Harrison said. "Every moment, every choice exactly the same if it meant ending up right here with you." "Even the hard parts?" Flora asked. "The lean years, the sick cows, the winter we nearly lost everything, even those," Harrison said. "Because we faced them together." Flora squeezed his hand. "Then we did it right." As the last light faded from the sky and the stars began to appear, their youngest grandchild, a girl of 5 named Flora after her grandmother, came running out onto the porch. "Grandma, Grandpa, it is time for cake," she announced, tugging on Harrison's hand. "We cannot miss cake," Harrison said solemnly, allowing himself to be pulled to his feet. "Absolutely not," Flora agreed, standing with more grace than Harrison despite being the same age. They went inside together, into the warmth and light and love of the family they had created. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the children had cleaned up and headed to their own homes or the guest rooms, Harrison and Flora lay in bed together, Flora curled against Harrison's side as she had been every night for 40 years. "Thank you," Flora said softly into the darkness. "For what?" "For finding me, for saving me, for giving me this life." "Thank you for being there to find," Harrison replied. "For being brave enough to leave everything behind, for choosing me." "Always you," Flora murmured, already drifting toward sleep. "From that first moment in the rain, it was always you." Harrison held her close, listening to her breathing even out as she fell asleep. He thought about that rainstorm, about the soaked, desperate woman he had found stumbling through the mud. He thought about how close he had come to not riding out that day, to not being in the right place at the right time. But he had been there, and she had been there, and everything that mattered had grown from that moment of chance or fate or divine intervention, whatever you wanted to call it. The rain had brought Flora to him, but it was the sunshine of their love that had sustained them through everything that came after. They had built a life together, a family, a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. They had faced hardships and celebrated joys, and through it all, they had each other. Harrison closed his eyes, Flora warm and safe in his arms, and thought that for a lonely cowboy and a runaway bride, they had done pretty well for themselves. The rainstorm had passed long ago, but the sunshine remained, as bright and warm as the day they had realized they were in love. And that sunshine would continue to shine through their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a legacy of love that began on a muddy road in the rain and grew into something beautiful and enduring. Harrison drifted off to sleep with a smile on his face, grateful for rainstorms and second chances and the woman who had become his whole world. The years that followed were peaceful. Harrison and Flora settled into a comfortable rhythm of grandparenthood, spending their days helping where they could, but mostly enjoying watching the younger generations take over the work of the ranch and carry on the family name. They took walks together every evening, moving more slowly now but still hand in hand, still finding things to talk about after all these years. They would sit on the porch and watch Henry working with the cattle, or wave to Helen as she drove past on her way to make house calls, or listen to Harold's latest composition when he came home for visits. Hope brought her students to the ranch, sometimes for lessons about animal husbandry and farming, and Harrison and Flora would watch the children run around the property with the same wonder and joy their own children had shown decades before. Flora's sister Frances passed away peacefully in her sleep at 72, and Flora grieved for the sister who had stood by her when it mattered most. Harrison held her through the tears, understanding that some losses never fully heal, they just become part of who you are. Their father had died years before, never having reconciled with Flora. But Frances had told her before she died that he had kept a photograph of Flora and her family in his desk drawer, that he would take it out sometimes when he thought no one was watching. It was not forgiveness, but it was something, and Flora found a measure of peace in knowing that perhaps, in his own way, he had been proud of her after all. When Harrison was 68 and Flora 66, Harrison suffered a fall from his horse, breaking his hip and spending weeks confined to bed. Flora nursed him with the same fierce determination she had brought to everything else in her life, refusing to let him sink into despair or give up. "You found me in a rainstorm and brought me back to life," she told him when he complained about being useless. "I am not about to let you give up now." Harrison healed slowly but completely, and though he walked with a slight limp afterward, he was able to return to his life and his family. The incident reminded them both that their time was precious, that every day together was a gift. They made the most of those days, cherishing the quiet moments as much as the celebrations. They taught their great-grandchildren to ride and to garden and to play piano. They told stories about the old days, about the rainstorm and the courtship, and building their life together. The great-grandchildren would listen with wide eyes, finding it hard to believe that their old grandparents had once been young and in love, but Harrison and Flora would exchange glances and smile, remembering exactly how it had felt. On Harrison's 75th birthday, the family gathered once again for a celebration. The ranch had been officially signed over to Henry years before, but everyone still called it the Garrett Ranch, and everyone knew that Harrison and Flora were the heart of it all. Harrison looked around at the crowd of people, trying to count them all and losing track somewhere around 40. Children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, in-laws and friends, all gathered because 75 years ago, he had been born, and 50 years ago, he had been riding through a rainstorm and found the woman who would change everything. "Quite a legacy," Henry said, coming to stand beside his father. "Your mother and I did all right," Harrison agreed. "Better than all right, Dad. You built something real here, something that is going to last." Harrison watched Flora across the yard, surrounded by children and laughing at something one of the great-grandchildren had said. Even at 73, she was beautiful, her white hair gleaming in the sunshine and her green eyes still as bright as the day he met her. "I did not build it," Harrison said. "We built it together. That is the secret, son, finding the right person and building together." "I know," Henry said. "You and Mom taught us that." As evening fell and the party wound down, Harrison and Flora found their way back to the porch, back to their rocking chairs, back to their favorite spot in all the world. The valley stretched out before them in the fading light, beautiful and eternal. 50 years, Flora said softly. 50 years since you found me in that rain. Best decision I ever made, stopping to help, Harrison said. Best decision I ever made getting on that stage in St. Louis, Flora countered. They rocked in comfortable silence, watching the first stars appear. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night?" Flora asked. "When I was crying about my father, I told you that you were not alone," Harrison said, "that you had me for as long as you wanted." "I still want you," Flora said, reaching over to take his hand, "for as long as we have." "Forever then," Harrison said. "That is how long I plan to love you." "Forever sounds just right," Flora agreed. They sat together as the darkness settled over the valley and the lights came on in the house behind them. Inside, their family was cleaning up and getting ready for bed, the children being herded upstairs and the adults saying their goodnights. Harrison and Flora stayed on the porch, unwilling to leave the perfect peace of the moment. They had spent so many evenings just like this, thousands of them over 50 years, and Harrison knew he would never tire of it. Never tire of sitting beside this woman and watching the day end. "Thank you," Harrison said. "For what?" Flora asked, though she was smiling like she knew. "For everything. For saying yes when I asked you to stay, for marrying me, for giving me these 50 years and this family and this life, for being my sunshine." Flora leaned over and kissed him, soft and sweet. "Thank you for finding me, for taking me home, for loving me even when I was just a bedraggled stranger in the rain." "Especially then," Harrison said. They went inside eventually, into the house they had shared for half a century, into the bedroom where they had loved and laughed and weathered all of life's storms together. They lay down side by side, Flora's head on Harrison's shoulder, and both of them felt the deep contentment of a life well lived. The rainstorm that had brought them together was long past, but its effects rippled outward still, in every child and grandchild, in every act of love and courage they had inspired. Flora had been right all those years ago. They were sunshine for each other, and that light had spread to warm everyone around them. As they drifted off to sleep, Harrison thought about the young man he had been, lonely and resigned to a solitary life. He thought about how one decision, one act of kindness, had transformed everything. He thought about Flora, always Flora, and how loving her had been the greatest adventure of his life. Tomorrow they would wake and there would be breakfast to make and grandchildren to spoil, and 1,000 small moments that made up a life. But tonight, they simply held each other and were grateful. Grateful for rainstorms and second chances, and a love that had weathered every season and emerged stronger for it. The story of Harrison and Flora Garrett was not a tale of grand adventures or dramatic rescues, though it had started with both. It was instead a story of steady, enduring love, of two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and built something beautiful together. It was a story of sunshine after the rain, of hope after despair, of finding home in another person rather than a place. It was a story that would be told and retold by their descendants for generations to come. A reminder that sometimes the best things in life come when you are brave enough to change course, to take a chance, to stop and help a stranger in a storm. And it was a story that, for Harrison and Flora themselves, was still being written with every day they spent together, every moment they chose each other again and again and again. Because that was what love was in the end. Not just the grand gesture of the rainstorm rescue, but the daily choice to stay, to build, to weather whatever storms might come together. They had made that choice 50 years ago and every day since, and they would continue making it for as long as they both drew breath. And when the time came for them to leave this world, they would go knowing they had lived fully, loved completely, and left behind a legacy of light that would shine on long after they were gone. But that time was still to come. For now, there was just this moment, this night, this perfect piece of two souls who had found each other in the rain and created their own eternal sunshine. And that, Harrison thought as sleep finally claimed him, was more than enough. It was everything.